Brandy T at Granny T Farms. I thought I'd take a few minutes today and show you how I make bone broth for my family. It does take about 48 hours to cook down, but the preparation is super simple. All you have to do is get your bones ready, and then you let the slow cookers do the work for 2 days, and then you take it off and you have bone broth in your freezer for any time you need it. So let's make some broth. So here's our bones. I'm going to put these in the oven, roast them on 400 for about 45 minutes. We've got soup bones over here, which this is about 4 pounds, neck and rib bones. We've got shank, which these come 2 to a pack. We have knuckle. If you get the bone broth pack, we include 2 of the knuckles. And what this does, it'll make about 1 10-quart crock or 2 5 to 6 quart crocks. And if you do all this at one time, I usually get a yield of about 4 to 5 quarts of broth. And then another reason I like to use these cuts is because I'll also get about 1 quart of rendered tallow, which I love to clean up. It's shelf stable once you clean it up, and save it and use it for cooking and flavoring as well. Okay, so I've got these crocks ready to go. I did take a few pictures. I didn't video before I put the water in, but we've got a knuckle, and then we split up the soup bones evenly, and 1 shank, and this one's the same way, and you see I've filled it up to the rim. And I did put about 1/4 cup, a little bit less, of apple cider vinegar. Now this is supposed to help the bones break down. I've done this without it and it's worked just fine, and that would depend on your dietary preference if you want to use vinegar or not. So it will work either way. And we're going to put this in the crocks, and I am going to cook this for 48 hours. I'm going to bring it to a low simmer. So we're about 36 hours into this broth. I see we've kept it on a simmer, and I've also kept the water to it. So about once a day I go in and I'll fill the water back up to the rim, but I won't do this anymore. So I'm going to let this cook another 8 to 12 hours without filling this up, because I don't want my broth too watery. I want it to gel. After 48 hours and you're ready to remove your broth, just make sure you have a pan to put your bones in. You'll need something to scoop the bones out, either some tongs or some sort of ladle. I do recommend having a ladle. I'm going to use a strainer, and then I'm going to use an extra fine strainer. I also recommend that you have a metal bowl, especially if you're taking the broth off when it's hot. We do recommend that you let it cool a little bit so it is safe to work with. And then some sort of freezer container. So this is all that I need when I'm ready to start straining my broth. So here we are at 48 hours. I've taken the crock pots off. I've also scooped out my bones. I just use a ladle and a strainer. What we're going to do now is I'm going to strain off this broth. So here we are. This is 2 crock pots, and I've strained this off once out of both pots and put this in a big mixing bowl, and it is hot. You'll notice it's really light colored. There is a lot of fat in my broth because I wanted it that way. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this cool just a little bit, and then I'm going to dip. I'm going to take this ladle and I'm going to dip the fat off the top and separate that so that we will have that to keep and use later in our cooking. Okay, you can see this is cooled just a little bit. So what I am going to do is I'm going to take this small ladle, and I've got a cup here. Now actually this would be best to use if you've got a metal, like a metal thermos. It works really well to do this. I've been using the plastic as long as we let this cool. because it's almost the same size throughout, so when I pull my tallow out I can just clean it off. But if you have like a nice metal thermos, this works really well too. So we just dip the ladle in and just barely take what's on top. And you can see, if you look, you can see the fat, you can see the coloring change. You'll just see, I'm not dipping the ladle all the way in because the fat's going to rise to the top, and you can just ladle that off. And you notice I'm getting some darker swirls, so I'm getting into the broth, and I'm probably just going to stop here. But you can see the top of the pan, I don't know, maybe it's 1/4 of an inch. We've still got some fat in here. And there'll be some that rises to the top of your bone broth. And I like to leave a little layer on just to help it when you freeze it. Plus, that's just an extra layer. When I pull it out, I can use it for something. Okay, my next step is to drain the broth. Now, I've already run this through a strainer, a medium-sized strainer. I have a fine strainer. This is just a fine size strainer. And I am using plastic freezer containers, so you do want this to cool enough before you start doing your broth. You're going to put it in these containers. But I'm going to ladle this off into these containers and strain it again, just because I want mine really clean. So here's our finished product. So we had 2 5-quart crock pots cooking for 48 hours. And I've got 5 quarts of really deep colored broth here. And then I've got a whole quart of rendered beef fat. So we'll let this cool. I'll check it in the morning to see if it gels, and show you what that should look like. Okay, we're going to check our broth. I like to wait 24 hours because I like to make sure it's good and cold so I can actually see what happened. And there will be a layer of fat that has risen to the top. You can just peel that off when you use your broth. I like to use it for flavoring. I'll store it in the refrigerator for a few days if I don't need to use it immediately, but there is broth on there, so it's not shelf stable. You would have to clean that up. So here's the broth, and this actually gelled perfectly. This is what I'm looking for when I use the joint bones. Now, there's a lot of things that could cause your broth not to gel. Adding water too late, adding too much water, cooking at high temps, cooking it for too long, or not cooking it long enough. All of that can contribute, but you still have a nice nutrient-dense stock that you can use. So don't worry if it doesn't gel. It will take a little bit sometimes to decide exactly what works for your slow cooker. But this is what we're looking for. This is great. I like to heat this up, put it in a mug, drink it with some ginger, and we flavor our dishes with it. So 100% grass-fed bone broth is a great way to add nutrients to your diet. I would recommend you use this within 5 days if you're going to keep it in the fridge. If not, just freeze it, pull it out when you need it. So here's the rendered tallow. I like to leave this in the refrigerator for 24 hours just to let it set up. So it's really hard so we can get it out of the container. And before I take it out, I just want you to notice there is a color variation. Also depends on how you filtered this. You may have a light color and then you'll have more broth at the bottom. In this particular container, I have a lot of broth. You'll usually have just a little, it'll just get lighter and lighter until you have a very dark bottom if you filtered everything off really well. And I may have a photo of that I will try to include. So we just need to take something in our container to loosen the tallow, and this is why I recommend that you use a metal container. There's less chance of poking a hole in it when you do that, but I've learned to work with the freezer containers. And then you just pull it out. So here's the broth. Here is where the tallow, you can feel, is really firm. So we want to trim this off right here at the base. And you want to make sure that you get all of these bits off. You want it nice and clean. See, I'm going to trim that off as well. And what this does, you're just getting it down to solid tallow, which is shelf stable. If you leave the broth on, you would want to freeze it. But I've just completely trimmed that off. You can store it at room temperature in a cool, dark place. You just need to keep it dry. What I like to do is just chunk it up, because you can see if you start cutting into it. I cut it into chunks, and then I put it back in a container. And then I can just pull it out and use a chunk when I need it. And you can freeze these chunks in your containers, so you can just pull out what you need. And there you go. Rendered beef tallow.